The name Amenhotep means Amun is pleased, a sentiment that honored the leading deity of the era. Amun had been the obscure local god of the Thebans. When they gained the throne in the 18th dynasty, they sponsored the god's rise to unrivaled preeminence in the Egyptian pantheon. Amun won even more status when he merged with the sun god Re to become Amun-Re. The truth was, however, that Amun-Re lacked definition and seemed colorless when compared to such earthly personalities among the ancient deities, such as Osiris, Horus, and for that matter, the goddess Isis. Amun-Re was the hidden one who, in his ubiquity, transforms himself into an infinity of forms. Every god is in him. Notwithstanding his enigmatic character, however, Amun-Re's special relationship with the Theban monarchs had brought measureless wealth and power, beyond calculation, to the estates of his priesthood. Inevitably, both Amun-Re and his cult were the objects of bitter envy on the part of the priestly followers of gods who had been eclipsed. The young Prince Amenhotep was prominent among those who developed a virulent hatred of Amun-Ra. Just why this happened is not known. Perhaps he was influenced by his priest teachers, the temple at Heliopolis, which was the center of the sun cult. At any rate, scarcely had the crown been placed upon his head than he launched an obsessive campaign to outlaw not only Amun-Re, but also other deities, and replace them with the one and only Aten, the sun disk. The chief promoter of the Aten was a most peculiar king. Amenhotep IV was grotesque in appearance. He had a huge gourd-shaped head that perched on a neck so long and slender it seemed hardly capable of bearing its burden. Slanted eyes, pulpy lips, and a knobby chin, pot-belly mindful of a woman of early pregnancy, gigantic thighs, and matchstick chins. And it was speculated he suffered a glandular disorder that resulted in eunuchism, deformed his body, and unbalanced his emotions. Such theories were, however, seriously undermined by the fact that Amenhotep indisputably sired 6 daughters, and less certainly 1 or 2 sons, by his wife Queen Nefertiti, who was an aggressive partner in championing the cause of the sun disk god. Her name meant, "The beautiful one is come," and she more than lived up to that epithet. The new pharaoh espoused a god devoid of human characteristics. In Egyptian language, Aten was a noun meaning disk of the sun, no more, no less. To the mind of young Amenhotep IV, however, the Aten was no mere disk. It was the sublime, living sun disk. There is none other than he. At first the king made concessions to tradition by allowing his god to be personified in the form of a man with a falcon's head. But that soon ceased, and thereafter the Aten was represented by a hieroglyphic symbol of a disk radiating rays that terminated in hands, which held the Ankh, or symbol of life. Thus, the deity the Egyptians were now under obligation to worship was one completely removed from human appearance, with neither the substance of statuary nor the fabric of legend to lend him credibility. During the early years, the pharaoh permitted the conventional gods to coexist with the Aten, although with greatly reduced status. In the 5th or 6th year of his reign, however, the pharaoh further displayed his dissatisfaction with the old gods by changing his own name. No longer would the king be called Amenhotep, a word that honored Amen in its first 2 syllables. Instead, the pharaoh's name would be reflecting the glory of a new deity, and so Amenhotep IV became Akhenaten, or the spirit of the Aten. About this same time, Akhenaten began looking for a suitable place to build a new capital that he could dedicate to the Aten. The site he chose on the east bank of the Nile, about 200 miles north of Thebes, was a grim sandy plain, cloistered by frowning cliffs, where no gods had ever been worshipped, no one had ever lived, and no one but Akhenaten would ever wish to. In the full flood of his enthusiasm, he himself laid out the building plans for 5 temples of the Aten, and a sumptuous palace where the pharaoh and his family would dwell, even drew up the city's street plan. Although it has since become known as Amarna, Akhenaten called his new capital Akhetaten, the horizon of Aten. Work proceeded in a frenzied state, but so eager was Akhenaten to live in his new city that he had a huge tent erected for himself and his court. After 4 years of construction, the buildings were finally ready for occupancy. Yet before he departed from Thebes for his new home, Akhenaten fired a blast that shook the empire to its foundations. Henceforth, he decreed, all Egyptians and all Syrians and Nubians in Egyptian thrall would worship only the Aten, whose light bathed humanity in each of its affairs. What was more, only Akhenaten, as the beautiful child of the disk, could engage in dialogue with the Aten. The pharaoh alone was privy to the god's designs for the universe, and he alone could interpret the divine will by which humanity must exist. And Akhenaten enforced his mandate with a fanatic's fury. He was especially ruthless with his treatment of Amun-Re, the god brought to prominence by his own Theban forebears. All citizens were required to follow the pharaoh's example by changing their names if they honored the offending deity. Squads of workers, chisels in hand, were sent out to expunge the name of Amun-Re on monuments, walls, or temples. Indeed, even Akhenaten's former name, along with that of his father Amenhotep III, was obliterated. Statues of Amun-Re were smashed, his temples closed, the revenues of his vast estates confiscated. Some citizens resisted clandestinely. They quietly continued to worship their favorite deities, even at Amarna, where amulets to the god Bas were still being used during the time of Akhenaten's reign. Their secret opposition made little difference, because the priestly cults of the traditional gods were deeply embedded not only in Egypt's religious behavior, but in its society, its economy, its administration, and its politics. The results of Akhenaten's campaign proved devastating. Obsessed with his god, the pharaoh paid little attention to his government and allowed corruption to creep into Egyptian bureaucracy. At every level of his administration, officials bribed and stole while the king pressed his religious crusade. In the confused state of affairs, public works deteriorated and trade dwindled. Yet by no means were all of Akhenaten's influences malign. To the visual art of the Egyptians, for example, he breathed a new and vibrant life. Early in his reign, the pharaoh assembled about him the royal sculptors, led by a man named Bek, and issued instructions. No longer would pharaohs be depicted in the style that had been conventional for millennia and rendered them as stiff as obelisks, expressionless as mummies, as alike as the papyrus reeds of the delta marshes. Akhenaten was singular. He was unique. He was the son of the Aten and must be portrayed in all his individuality. The sculptors took him at his word, and then some, possibly exaggerating the physical grotesqueries. The new naturalism swept the spectrum of Egyptian art, from statuary to reliefs to painting. For the first time, Egyptians were allowed glimpses of their pharaoh in the intimate surroundings of home and family. A charming scene, carved in stone, showed Akhenaten kissing one little princess while another sat on Nefertiti's lap and a third played with a toy that just happened to be the crown of imperial Egypt. Similarly, in long, curved lines, man and beast came alive. The elderly showed their age. Married couples were portrayed with warmth. Children looked like children instead of stunted adults. And birds seemed to fly rather than appearing lifeless and frozen as they had in earlier eras. The art thus promoted by Akhenaten would far outlive both the heretical pharaoh himself and the god that he championed. For while the Egyptian king was pursuing his obsessions, his empire was menaced. In Syria, vassal kings called for help from the Egyptian army, but the pharaoh was too preoccupied to listen. Bearing down on them from Asia Minor were Hittite warriors under the mighty king Suppa-Alima, who had defeated the Mitanni once and for all, and was moving to challenge Egyptian hegemony. The salvation of the empire would be left to Akhenaten's successors. He died in the 17th year of his reign, and to all intents and purposes, his sun disk god died with him.